The wind howled through the forest, scattering brittle leaves across the dirt road. Beneath the bare branches, 5 figures trudged forward, a ragtag band of adventurers seeking their fortune. The town of Westham lay far behind, and ahead loomed their destination, the ruins of Saran's temple, a place shrouded in ancient mystery. They had heard rumors of gold, enchanted artifacts, and relics long lost to time. Yet none of them expected the arrival of her. They first saw her silhouette through the forest haze, a figure unlike anything they had encountered before. She stood tall and elegant, her skin shimmering with hues that shifted from pale silver to deep violet under the filtered moonlight. Her long, translucent hair floated as if caught in a gentle breeze, though no wind stirred the air around her. When she stepped forward, the adventurers instinctively reached for their weapons. "I come in peace," she said, her voice like a song, carrying warmth yet edged with sorrow. "I need your help." Darren, the leader of the group, narrowed his eyes. He was a grizzled fighter, his face scarred from battles long forgotten, and trust was not something he offered freely. "We don't take kindly to strangers, miss." "Who are you?" She tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his without fear. "I am called ZTH, she said softly. "My people are not from this world." The group exchanged glances. Tobin, the young warrior, stepped closer, curiosity burning in his wide eyes. "Not from this world? What does that mean?" ZTH folded her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. "I will explain in time. But know this, I need your help. And in return, I will reward you beyond your wildest dreams." Darren snorted. "We've heard promises like that before. They always lead to one place, a knife in the back." ZTH's gaze didn't waver. "I seek no betrayal. Only your assistance. My condition is unique. My kind's life cycle demands that I breed soon, or I will die. I came here hoping to find companions among your people." Her words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Larth, the group's mage, adjusted his hood and muttered a spell under his breath to detect any deceit in ZTH's aura. His brow furrowed as the results puzzled him. "She's not lying," Larth whispered. "Her life force is waning, but she's telling the truth about needing help." From the back of the group, Brindle, the thief, smirked. "Well, this is new. Usually, people offer us gold, not mating rituals." Darren shot him a glare. "Shut it, Brindle." ZTH looked down, clearly sensing the discomfort her request had caused. "I know this is not your way, but you are my last hope. Without your help, my body will fail before the next moon." She paused, as if the words cost her something to say. "Please." Silence followed. The only sounds were the creaking of branches and the distant call of an owl. After a long moment, Darren cleared his throat. "We're headed to the Sarian ruins. You want to tag along, fine. But we're not agreeing to anything strange." His eyes flicked to Tobin and Brindle. "We'll hear you out when we get there." Relief washed over ZTH's face, though her alien features made it appear ghostly and haunting. "Thank you." With a cautious nod, Darren gestured for her to follow. The group resumed their journey, the forest seeming darker than before. ZTH walked with an ethereal grace, her luminous presence a stark contrast to the grimy, battle-worn adventurers. Tobin, unable to resist his curiosity, fell in step beside her. "You don't seem like someone who just stumbles onto a world like ours," he said, keeping his voice low. "Why come here? Why us?" ZTH glanced at him, her silver-violet skin rippling with subtle light. "Your world is compatible. And your people, despite their flaws, have a spirit unlike any I have known. I sensed your presence, your strength. I hoped you would understand." "Understand what?" Tobin pressed. ZTH hesitated. "That life is not always what we expect it to be. That sometimes, survival means seeking help from the most unlikely places." Tobin frowned but said nothing more. He couldn't tell if her words were poetic or just evasive. The ruins of Saran's temple finally came into view, jagged stone structures silhouetted against the starlit sky. Ancient carvings marred the temple walls, their meanings long forgotten. The air was heavy, charged with a presence none of them could explain. Darren raised a hand, signaling for caution. "Stay close. We don't know what's lurking in there. Zitich's eyes darkened. Something does lurk here. Before Darren could ask what she meant, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from within the ruins. Shadows shifted unnaturally, twisting like living things. Brindle drew his daggers, while Lartha's fingers glowed with magic. Tobin unsheathed his sword, his knuckles white against the hilt. Darren exhaled sharply. Looks like we're about to find out if you're worth the trouble, ZTH. She stepped forward, her glowing gaze fixed on the ruins. And you will find out if you are worthy of my trust. The wind howled again, and as they crossed the threshold of the temple, they knew there was no turning back. Thank you, she whispered. I promise I will not forget this kindness. The group continued their journey, Zeth walking silently beside them. Her presence unsettled them, not out of fear, but because of the strange magnetism she exuded. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was something deeper, as if her very existence tugged at some primal part of them. Tobin found himself glancing at her more often than he should, captivated by the way her skin caught the moonlight. Brindle, on the other hand, was already scheming, calculating what he could gain from the alien woman's plight. Larth remained cold and detached, though his mind buzzed with arcane curiosity. What kind of magic could sustain a being like her? Darren stayed focused, though even he found it difficult to ignore the unease creeping into his mind. They had faced bandits, beasts, and sorcerers in their time, but nothing quite like this, a woman from another world asking for their help, not to survive, but to breed. It was madness. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, dawn was breaking, casting golden light across the sprawling ruins of Saran's temple. The stone pillars stood cracked and weathered, covered in moss and tangled vines. A sense of ancient power lingered in the air, as if the very ground remembered the rituals once performed here. This is where we'll make camp, Darren announced. We'll rest, then explore the ruins at first light. The adventurers began setting up their camp, but Zeth stayed apart, gazing at the ancient stones with a strange expression, half nostalgia, half dread. You've been here before, Larth observed, stepping beside her. Zeth nodded slowly. Long ago, my kind walked among yours. We shared many things, but those days are gone. Larth frowned. What happened? Humans change, Zeth said softly, and so did we. The cryptic answer only deepened the mage's unease. He could feel the threads of history unraveling before him, ancient truths buried beneath centuries of myth and forgetfulness. But before he could ask more, Darren called out. Get some rest, the leader ordered. We've got a long day ahead of us. Zeth gave Larth one last glance before retreating to the shadows of the ruined temple. The adventurers settled in for the night, but sleep came slowly. Each of them lay awake with their thoughts, haunted by the knowledge that the journey they had begun was no ordinary adventure. And none of them, not even Zeth herself, knew what awaited them in the ruins ahead. The sun had barely touched the temple's broken walls when Darren roused the group. His eyes were heavy with sleeplessness, but years of command kept him sharp. The ruins of Saran's temple stretched before them, a maze of crumbled halls, leaning pillars, and stairways leading into darkness. The group prepared to explore, though each carried their own burden of doubt after meeting the alien beauty. Zeth remained seated on a large stone slab, her shimmering eyes watching the adventurers as they packed their gear. Her condition seemed to have worsened. Her breath came in shallow waves, and her once glowing skin had dimmed, the iridescent hues no longer shifting as vibrantly as before. You don't have much time, do you? Tobin asked, kneeling beside her. She offered a faint smile, but there was pain behind it. No. But there is still hope. Darren approached, arms crossed. Tell us what we're really walking into. Zeth's gaze drifted to the temple entrance. A choice, she said simply. For all of us. Silence fell over the group. The ruins loomed before them, ancient and waiting. Whatever secrets they held, whatever trials lay ahead, one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. Her glowing skin had lost its luster, now a dull and muted sheen. Each breath she took was shallow and uneven. Tobin, the young warrior, tried not to stare, but concern was etched onto his face. He knelt beside her hesitantly, his fingers twitching as though unsure whether to reach out. Are you all right? He asked awkwardly, his voice softer than he intended. Zidic's silvered eyelids fluttered as she turned her gaze toward him. "I will manage," she whispered, though her voice was weaker than before. "But I do not have much time." Tobin swallowed hard. He didn't fully understand what was happening to her, but something about her vulnerability stirred a deep, protective instinct within him. The way her chest barely rose with each breath, the way her body trembled, it was as if she were flickering like a dying flame. He opened his mouth to say something more, but Darren's sharp command cut through the moment. "Tobin, we're moving." Reluctantly, the young warrior stood, casting one last look at ZTH before following the others into the depths of the temple, leaving her alone to rest. The air inside the ancient structure was thick with dampness, carrying the scent of moss, old stone, and something else, something deeper and more unsettling. Shadows clung to every crevice, resisting the thin slivers of daylight that had managed to creep through the cracks in the ceiling. The temple walls bore the scars of time, their surfaces crumbling yet adorned with intricate carvings that whispered of a forgotten past. Brindle, the group's nimble-fingered thief, moved ahead of the others, his footsteps nearly silent as he scanned for traps. He had an uncanny ability to notice things others missed, whether hidden treasure or lurking dangers. His sharp eyes traced the lines of an ancient relief carved into the stone wall. It depicted figures both human and otherworldly, their elongated limbs and shimmering forms bearing an eerie resemblance to ZTH. Larth, the mage, stepped closer, his fingers ghosting over the carvings. A deep frown creased his brow. "These aren't just decorations," he murmured. "They're a story. A bond between humans and beings like ZTH. But it ended in violence." "Of course it did," Darren muttered, adjusting his grip on his sword. "Humans aren't good at playing nice." Tobin shifted uneasily. "You think ZTH knows about this?" Larth exhaled slowly. "If she does, she's keeping it to herself." Brindle smirked. "I bet she's hiding something. No one asks for help like that without an agenda." Darren shot him a warning glance. "Keep your mouth shut, Brindle. We don't need more trouble." They pressed on, their footsteps echoing down the stone corridors as they descended a flight of cracked steps. The air grew colder with each level they ventured deeper, until a strange hum seemed to vibrate through the stones beneath their feet. "This place isn't natural," Larth whispered, his voice tinged with unease. "There's magic here, old magic." Darren tightened his grip on his sword. "Stay alert. We're not alone down here." Back at the camp, ZTH sat alone on the weathered stone slab, her body trembling with each shallow breath. She could feel her life force slipping away, the cycle of her existence nearing its tragic end. Her kind were not meant to endure this phase alone. Without a mate, the energy inside her would spiral out of control, consuming her from within. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned her head slowly to see Brindle emerging from the temple's shadowed archway, a sly grin playing at his lips. "Couldn't resist," he said casually, stepping closer. "You don't look so good, love." ZTH's gaze darkened. "Why are you here?" Brindle shrugged, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a dagger tucked into his belt. "Just thought I'd check on you. Make sure you weren't hiding anything valuable." ZTH's muscles tensed, though she was too weak to stand. "I have nothing for you. Leave." The thief chuckled, circling her like a predator assessing wounded prey. "Come on now, no need to be so cold. You're dying, aren't you? Doesn't seem fair to let all that power go to waste. Maybe there's something I can do to ease your passing." His meaning was clear, and it sent a shiver down her spine, not out of fear, but out of a deep, simmering fury. She might be weak, but she was far from helpless. Fixing him with a piercing stare, she whispered something in her native tongue, a soft, melodic hum that sent a ripple through the air. For the briefest moment, Brindle's smug expression faltered. And then the earth beneath them shifted. Brindle took another step forward, his smirk unwavering as he studied Zala's weakened form. "Just thought I'd see how you were holding up," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling edge. "Thought maybe you'd need some help." Zala's lips curled into a bitter smile, though it lacked strength. "Help, or something else?" Brindle chuckled, tilting his head. "Can a man not do both?" Her body ached, exhaustion clouding her mind like a heavy fog. She knew the thief's intentions were far from noble. Even if she had the strength to resist, there was little she could do now. Her life force was fading. "You cannot force this," she whispered. "It will only end in pain." Brindle's grin widened. "Guess we'll have to see about that." Deep within the temple, the rest of the adventurers stumbled upon something extraordinary, an altar of black stone, covered in ancient inscriptions. Lartha's breath hitched as he traced his fingers over the worn carvings, his mind working quickly to decipher the meaning. "This altar, it was used for rituals to bond with beings like Zala," he murmured. "But it says something else. If the bond is not properly completed, it will consume both the host and the mate." Darren cursed under his breath. That alien woman knew this would happen, didn't she? Larth shook his head. "I don't think so. I think she came here out of desperation, not knowing the full consequences." Tobin's face paled. "We need to go back. If we don't do this right." A scream shattered the air, echoing through the temple halls. A cry of agony, Zala's voice. "Brindle!" Tobin shouted, sprinting toward the entrance, the others close behind him. The pounding of their boots against the stone floors merged with the frantic beat of their hearts as they raced toward the surface. When they emerged from the temple, the sight before them made their blood run cold. Zala lay sprawled on the ground, her body writhing in pain, an eerie, pulsing light emanating from her skin. Brindle knelt beside her, his face twisted with terror as he scrambled away from the alien woman. The confidence and bravado he always wore like armor were gone, replaced by sheer panic. "It's not working," Brindle shouted, his voice laced with horror. "I didn't mean she's dying." Tobin rushed forward, shoving Brindle aside as he dropped to his knees beside Zala. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. Brindle stammered, his usual arrogance shattered. "She asked for help. I thought I could." "Idiot!" Larth hissed, kneeling beside Zala and pressing his hand to her forehead. His expression darkened. "Her body's rejecting the bond. It's too late." Zala's glowing eyes fluttered open, her gaze locking onto Tobin's. Her breathing was shallow, her once luminous skin now dim. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not mean for this." Tobin's heart clenched as he held her trembling hand. "Stay with me," he pleaded. "We can fix this." A sad smile touched her lips. "No, it is already over." With a final shuddering breath, the light in her eyes faded, and her body went still. Silence swallowed the camp. The only sound was the distant whisper of the wind through the ruins. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had happened hung over them like a dark cloud. Darren exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair before kicking a loose stone in frustration. "We're in deep trouble now." Larth nodded grimly. She was the daughter of a prince. If her people find out what happened, "They'll come for us," Tobin finished, his voice hollow with grief and anger. Brindle slumped to the ground, his hands shaking. What have I done?" Tobin clenched his fists, torn between his fury and his sorrow. "We need to leave. Now." Darren didn't hesitate. "Pack up. We move before nightfall." As the adventurers hurriedly gathered their things, the truth of their actions settled into their bones. They had come seeking fortune and adventure. Instead, they had found tragedy. And deep in their hearts, each of them knew that the consequences of Zala's death would follow them for the rest of their lives. The air grew heavier as the group fled the ruins, their steps hasty and their hearts burdened with the grim reality of what had transpired. Zala's lifeless body was left behind, an alien beauty lost in a strange world, her final breath stolen by human folly. The silence among them was deafening, the weight of their actions pressing down like an unbearable curse. Darren led them through the forest, his usual confidence now laced with an edge of urgency. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, deepening the unease that clung to them like a second skin. No one spoke, but their thoughts were written across their weary faces. Tobin lagged behind, his mind plagued by the image of Zala's lifeless eyes. His heart felt like a lead weight in his chest. He should have stayed with her. Maybe if he had been there, things wouldn't have ended this way. The ache in his soul was unlike anything he had felt before, an emptiness that no battle or hardship had ever carved into him. "You all right, kid?" Larth asked quietly, falling into step beside him. The mage's dark robe swayed as he walked, staff tapping softly against the earth. "No," Tobin muttered, his voice raw. "We left her. We left her to die. She was doomed the moment we met her," Larth said, his tone cool but not unkind. "Whatever curse bound her, we couldn't have saved her." Tobin clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. "It doesn't feel right." "None of this does," Larth admitted, his voice uncharacteristically grim. "And it's only going to get worse." Ahead, Darren turned sharply. "Less talking, more moving," he barked. "We need to make distance before the sun sets." Brindle trailed at the rear of the group, pale and fidgeting. The usual swagger was drained from him, his every movement jittery, like a man being haunted by his own reflection. Every now and then, Tobin would glance back and see Brindle rubbing his hands together compulsively, as if trying to wash away an invisible stain. They marched until the sky turned to dusk, finally setting up camp in a secluded glade surrounded by dense trees. No one spoke as they gathered around a fire, its crackling warmth offering little comfort against the creeping cold. The tension hung thick in the air, an unspoken weight pressing against them. Brindle sat at the edge of the clearing, eyes locked on the flames, his hands still shaking. Larth kept watch while Darren methodically checked his gear, preparing for whatever might come next. The stillness was suffocating, and Tobin couldn't stand it any longer. He shot to his feet and rounded on Brindle, anger burning in his gaze. "This is your fault." Brindle flinched, his head snapping up. Fear and shame flashed across his face. "I didn't know this would happen." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Tobin roared, taking a step closer. "She trusted us and you." "Enough." Darren's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stood, placing himself between the two. "This isn't helping. What's done is done." Tobin's fists trembled at his sides, his fury barely restrained. But Darren's hard gaze kept him in check. "Sit down," Darren ordered. Reluctantly, Tobin dropped onto a nearby log, though the anger still simmered beneath his skin. Darren turned his attention to Brindle. "You crossed the line," he said, his voice like cold steel. "But right now, we've got bigger problems." Brindle swallowed hard and nodded, though he looked like a man teetering on the edge of collapse. Larth, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "We've stirred something ancient," he murmured, his gaze distant. "Zala wasn't just a lost traveler. She was something more. Something important." Darren frowned. "What are you saying?" Larth exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I think we just started a war." The fire crackled, but its warmth no longer reached them. An unnatural stillness settled over the glade, as if the forest itself was listening. The weight of their choices loomed heavy in the night, and they all knew, no matter how far they ran, the consequences of Zala's death would follow them, shadowing their every step. Bound to this ruin, we've disrupted whatever magic tied her to it. Darren's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" Larth leaned closer to the fire, his gaze thoughtful. "Zala's death might not be the end of this. If her people sense what's happened, they'll come for us, and they won't stop until they have answers." Brindle shivered. "You think they'll know she's dead?" "Her kind is bound by more than flesh," Larth murmured. "Her spirit could call out, even from across worlds." Darren cursed under his breath. "So we're running from a prince now?" Larth nodded gravely. "And the prince won't just come for us, he'll come for vengeance." Night fell, and the forest grew eerily quiet. A chill crept through the trees, and the fire seemed smaller, as if the weight of their actions pressed down on the very air around them. Tobin found himself unable to sleep. He sat apart from the others, staring up at the sky. Somewhere out there, Zala's kin would be searching for her. Would they know the truth of what had happened, or would they assume the worst? A soft rustle behind him drew his attention. He turned to see Brindle standing awkwardly, wringing his hands. "I'm sorry," the thief whispered. Tobin glared at him. "Sorry won't bring her back." Brindle's face twisted with guilt. "I know. I didn't mean for any of this." Tobin exhaled sharply, his anger draining into exhaustion. "Go back to camp, Brindle. Just stay away from me." Brindle nodded silently and slunk back into the shadows. Tobin returned his gaze to the stars, a knot of sorrow and regret tightening in his chest. Just before dawn, Larth stirred the camp awake. "We need to move," he said quietly. "I can feel something in the air, like we're being watched." Darren grunted as he stood and began kicking dirt over the fire. "Pack up. We'll head north and cut through the valley." Tobin noticed the way Lartha's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his staff. The mage was rarely unnerved, and the sight unsettled him more than anything else. As they prepared to leave, Tobin caught sight of a strange glow on the horizon, a soft ethereal light flickering just beyond the forest edge. "Do you see that?" Tobin whispered to Larth. The mage's eyes narrowed. "Yes. And I don't like it." The glow grew brighter, casting an unnatural light across the treetops. A low hum vibrated through the ground, making the hairs on the back of Tobin's neck stand on end. Darren cursed. "They found us." Before anyone could respond, the forest erupted with movement. Shadows shifted and twisted, and strange figures emerged from the trees, tall, elegant beings with glowing eyes and skin that shimmered like moonlight. Zala's kin. The adventurers drew their weapons, but it was already too late. The alien beings moved with impossible speed, surrounding the group in an instant. One stepped forward, a figure taller and more regal than the rest, his gaze cold and unforgiving. Tobin knew immediately who he was. The prince. "You killed her," the prince said, his voice low and filled with menace. "My daughter is dead because of you." Tobin's heart pounded in his chest. There was no escape. Now, only the cold, inevitable reckoning of a grieving father remained. Darren tightened his grip on his sword. "It was an accident," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The prince's luminous eyes narrowed. "There are no accidents here." Larth stepped forward cautiously. "We didn't understand what she needed," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "It wasn't meant to end this way." The prince's gaze flicked from Larth to Brindle, who cowered behind the others, his usual swagger lost to trembling fear. A cruel smile curled the prince's lips. "You will understand soon enough," the prince whispered. "All of you." Before anyone could react, he raised his hand, and the world around them dissolved into a cascade of shimmering light. The adventurers gasped as reality itself unraveled, their senses overwhelmed by the sudden shift. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in an endless void, a space outside of time, where nothing existed but glowing tendrils of light that pulsed with an eerie rhythm. The prince and his kin floated around them, silent and ethereal, like phantoms in a dream. The vastness of the void swallowed all sound, save for the steady thrum of unseen forces at work. Tobin's heart raced as he clutched his sword, feeling it tremble in his grip. Brindle knelt beside him, paralyzed by fear, while Darren and Larth stood ready, though their faces betrayed the same dread. The prince drifted closer, his radiant eyes brimming with both fury and sorrow. "You defiled her," he said, his voice reverberating through the void. "You took something irreplaceable, from me and from her people." His voice was not just filled with anger, it carried a grief so deep that it shook the very fabric of their surroundings. Darren took a cautious step forward. "It was a mistake. We didn't understand." The prince's hand shot out, and Darren was lifted off his feet by an invisible force. He gasped, clutching at his throat as the magic constricted his chest. "There are no excuses," the prince whispered coldly. "But there is still a way for justice to be served." The shimmering void rippled, and before them, Zala's body appeared, floating in the air as if suspended by unseen hands. She was perfectly preserved, her face serene, a tragic beauty frozen in the stillness of death. The sight made Tobin's heart ache. "She was the last of her kind to possess the ancient power to heal worlds," the prince murmured. "Her death is a wound that cannot be undone, unless one of you offers something of equal value." Tobin's mind raced. "What do you mean? What kind of offering?" The prince's eyes gleamed with grim certainty. "A life for a life. If one of you surrenders your soul willingly, she may yet live." A heavy silence fell over the group. The weight of the prince's demand pressed down on them like a crushing tide. Darren clenched his fists. "That's madness." Brindle whimpered. "We didn't know. How can you ask that of us?" Larth frowned, his gaze locked onto Zala's lifeless form. "If we bring her back, would it stop the curse that follows us?" The prince nodded slowly. "Yes. Restore her, and the debt is paid. Refuse, and my wrath will be eternal." Tobin took a deep breath, then stepped forward before anyone else could respond. "I'll do it." The words left his lips calmly, though his heart pounded like a war drum. "Tobin, no." Darren reached out, but Tobin shook his head. "This is the only way," Tobin said firmly. "We made a mistake. I can't live with it. And maybe this is how we make it right." Lartha's expression softened, though there was deep sadness in his eyes. "You don't have to do this alone, boy." Tobin managed a faint smile. "Yes, I do." He turned to the prince, his resolve unwavering. "Take my life. Let her live." The prince studied him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. The other ethereal beings watched in silence, their expressions neither cruel nor kind, only solemn. Then, slowly, the prince raised his hand once more. A radiant energy surrounded Tobin, lifting him from the ground. Pain unlike anything he had ever known seared through him, not of the body but of the soul itself. His vision blurred, his breath stolen as his essence was pulled from him. But through the agony, he saw something else, Zala's body stirring, light returning to her luminous skin. She gasped, her eyes fluttering open, filled with confusion and sorrow as she beheld the scene before her. "No," she whispered, reaching for Tobin, but it was too late. The last of his strength faded, and with one final exhale, his body dissolved into golden light, merging with the void. The prince lowered his hand, watching as Zala wept, her restored form trembling. He turned to the remaining adventurers, his expression unreadable. "The debt is paid. You are free to go." And with a wave of his hand, the void shattered, and the adventurers found themselves back in the forest, their world unchanged, except for the absence of one of their own. Tobin was gone. The prince's solemn nod sealed Tobin's fate. "Your sacrifice is accepted." A brilliant light engulfed him, consuming everything. Tobin felt weightless, as though his very soul was unraveling thread by thread. Yet, in that moment, there was no fear, only an overwhelming sense of peace. The world around him faded, and then, through the luminous void, he saw her. Zala. Her ethereal form drifted before him, her silver hair glimmering like woven moonlight. Color and vitality returned to her luminous skin, and her chest rose as she took in her first breath of renewed life. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since her tragic fall, she lived once more. Tobin, however, felt himself slipping away. His consciousness dimmed, his body fading into the void. He prepared to embrace the end, to surrender to the sacrifice he had willingly made. But then, a voice, soft and resolute. "No." Zala's voice. The light around him shifted, wrapping him in warmth instead of dissolution. Suddenly, he was whole again, his feet touching solid ground. Breath rushed into his lungs, and he gasped, staggering slightly as he returned to existence. He stared at Zala in disbelief. I don't understand." She stepped toward him, her glowing eyes filled with wonder. "You gave yourself for me," she whispered. "But your soul is not mine to take." The prince observed the exchange with quiet reverence, his expression no longer hardened with grief. Instead, there was something else, understanding, perhaps even respect. He inclined his head. "Your heart was pure. That was the only offering I truly needed." The void dissolved like mist under the morning sun, and in the blink of an eye, they were back in the forest clearing. The whisper of leaves in the wind and the crisp scent of earth filled the night air. Zala stood among them, radiant and whole, a beacon of otherworldly grace. But unlike before, she no longer seemed like an untouchable enigma. Now, there was warmth in her gaze, a quiet recognition of the beings around her. Brindle collapsed onto his knees, shuddering with a mixture of relief and pent-up emotion. Silent tears streaked his face as he let out a choked breath. Darren, ever the warrior, exhaled heavily and sheathed his sword, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. Even Larth, usually unreadable, offered a small, satisfied nod. Zala turned her gaze toward Tobin. "You have shown me something rare among your kind," she murmured. "Kindness, even in the face of fear." Tobin rubbed the back of his neck, his face coloring slightly. "I just wanted to do the right thing." A small smile played on Zola's lips. "And you did." The prince stepped forward, his imposing presence now tempered by solemnity rather than wrath. "Our paths must now part," he declared, his voice calm yet authoritative. "But know this, should your kind ever call upon us in need, we will answer. For you have proven that humans are more than I believed." With a flick of his hand, a shimmering portal of light materialized behind him. Zola hesitated for only a moment before turning back to Tobin, her luminous gaze filled with something unspoken, something that needed no words. Then she stepped through the portal, disappearing into the unknown. The prince followed, his regal form vanishing into the void. The portal swirled for a heartbeat longer before closing, leaving only the hush of the night in its wake. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Tobin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well, that was something." Darren clapped him on the back, shaking his head with a wry grin. "You did good, kid. Real good." Larth smirked faintly. "I suppose this means the curse is lifted. Now, shall we try not to awaken anything else ancient and vengeful on our next adventure?" Brindle sniffed and wiped his eyes before shaking his head vehemently. "I'm retiring after this." The group shared a tired, genuine laugh, light-hearted, yet touched by the weight of all they had endured. The world felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a great burden had finally been lifted. They packed their things in silence, their movements calm and unhurried. There was no more fear pressing on their chests, no looming dread of unseen consequences. As they set off into the forest, the horizon stretched ahead, promising new adventures beyond the trees. Just before they vanished into the undergrowth, Tobin paused and glanced back one last time. For a fleeting moment, he swore he saw a shimmer of silver between the trees, the barest flicker of a presence unseen but not forgotten. A silent farewell from an alien beauty who, in the end, had found something just as rare as she was. Trust. The end.